Hi, everyone, and welcome to Unpacking Islamophobia. I'm your host, Mobashra Tazamal. On today's episode, we have Dr. Saher Selod, who is an associate professor and previous chair of the Department of Sociology at Simmons University in Boston, Massachusetts. She's also the director of research at the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding. Professor Selod is the author of a number of books, including Forever Suspect, Racialized Surveillance of Muslim Americans in the War on Terror, and she also co-authored A Global Racial Enemy, Muslims and 21st Century Racism. And recently, she also authored one of the chapters in the newly released book, Global Islamophobia and Rise of Populism. And today we'll be discussing this chapter titled Islamophobia and the Rise of Ethno-National Populism in the US, along with her other work on the racialization of Muslims, global Islamophobia, and ISPU's recent report on Muslim American voters in swing states. Professor Selod, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Excited to be
Um,
here.
yeah, and as I mentioned in the introduction, you wrote a chapter in the newly released book, Global Islamophobia and the Rise of Populism. And in the chapter, you look at the roots of ethno-nationalist populism in the US, which played a role in the election of Donald Trump as the 45th president of the US. Can you expand on these roots and how Islamophobia played a role in it?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for that question. It's a really important one. So, I wrote this chapter in the co-edited book. It's co-edited by Professor Saher Selod and Professor John Esposito, and they were, looking for a piece on the role of populism on Islamophobia, and so. After the election of Donald Trump in 2016, a lot of what I was listening to on the news, on NPR, was about like how could, Donald Trump win the election in 2016? And I think we have to remember we're in a very different place right now than we were back then. Most people were surprised that he won that election. So it just really, started this, well, what's going on? A lot of people were talking about rural America, like what's happening in rural America? Why would they vote for somebody like this presidential candidate? And so a lot of what I felt like wasn't being discussed was the role of Islamophobia in his campaigning. So, when he was campaigning on a very overtly anti-Muslim, on very anti-Muslim rhetoric. So he was talking about banning Muslims, he was talking about registering Muslims. And this was something that really had an influence on other Republican candidates in the primary, for example. So we started to see this sort of rhetoric gain some traction amongst voters. So in this chapter, in this book, I really sort of start with, the January 6th insurrection, noting that the role of Islamophobia and, the election of somebody like Donald Trump, and that it had these roots that dated further back than just, Donald Trump. So, I talk about in the book how Donald Trump was a part of this, sort of movement that Obama was a Muslim, for example. So he was really, promoting that notion that Obama is a Muslim. He was, behind it. Like I said before, he was promising to sort of register and ban Muslims. And so he won the election while espousing very strong anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant sentiments. And I think it's really important to understand that he didn't invent it. He was capitalizing on, what we were seeing happening in the United States since 9/11. And just to note that anyone who studies, Islamophobia or the racialization of Muslims knows that 9/11 wasn't the starting point, but that we started to see after 9/11 a shift in how these types of like prejudices and discrimination against Muslims were really becoming more institutionalized in the United States. Um, So yeah, so happy to expand on some of that some more if you want.
Yeah, and I think one of you talked about how Donald Trump, one of the things that he was amplifying started around when Obama was president. And that was the birther conspiracy theory claiming, Obama's a secret Muslim. And along with that, I think you also, one of the other events that you talk about in your chapter is the Tea Party movement, which also gained momentum after the 2008 election of Obama. And I think a lot of people forget about the Tea Party movement because of where we are today. But I remember in 2010s how big the movement had gotten and how Islamophobia was really kind of escalating, and we were seeing it more in the media. We were seeing it being professed more loudly. Can you tell us how the Tea Party movement perpetuated Islamophobia and how it shaped the future of US politics?
Yeah, so in addition to the Tea Party movement having this very populist sort of flavor to it, right? Like, wanting less government involvement, there were factions of the Tea Party movement also that were really espousing anti-Muslim and Islamophobic sentiments. So we started to see things like, attacks on Keith Ellison, for example, who was at that time one of our first Muslim congressmen. So, there were factions of the Tea Party movement that were, really espousing a very ethno-nationalist populism. So this notion that the United States was being run over or taken over by immigrants, that Muslims were invading the United States. So the birther movement, like you mentioned, Obama being, questioned about his status as an American citizen, that he was seen as, people were demanding to see his birth certificate, and that he was also a Muslim, not only not an American citizen, but also a Muslim. And, we really saw a lot of that. And when Obama was president, like really getting a lot of, it was getting a lot of momentum around that time. And I appreciate that you saying that, like, we don't think about that right now in this moment. I think some of it is the rhetoric that we saw with the Tea Party movement, with the birther movement, and then also the anti-Sharia movement has just become it's just become so like ingrained. Like, it was like at one point academics like Chris Bale has a book that looks at, how these are far right or fringe ideologies about Muslims, and these fringe ideologies with the election of Trump and his campaigning really became more mainstream, within a certain segment of the population. So, we started to see like, politicians like Rick Scott, for example, we also may have forgotten the Ground Zero mosque, the Park 51 Islamic Center in New York, where there was a huge like movement to stop that center, that mosque from being built. And, Rick Scott was, quoted as referring it to as Obama's mosque and things like that. So, this is an important time period where we see the Tea Party movement and these Islamophobic, sort of actors like Pamela Geller, really getting a lot of attention and drawing attention to this notion that Islam is invading the United States. So we also see a lot of legislators introducing anti-Sharia bills claiming that Muslims are coming to, sort of take over the government and things like that. So really with, it was all of this stuff that was sort of brewing pre-Obama's election. And then we see Obama and, between when his first election in 2008 and 2009, 2010, we start to see all of this really, coming together. And so it's not surprising that Donald Trump would have been elected because this was all going on prior to when he ran for president.
Yeah, and I think around that time of 2010 Tea Party movement, and like you had mentioned, Pamela Geller, it was these anti-Muslim voices that previously were on the fringes, and they had these blogs, and they would send out email blasts, and Pamela Geller's blog was popular among a certain segment. And they started coming in more into, I don't know if I'd say mainstream, but more into the right wing, and they were getting a lot more attention because I think Geller was one of the organizers who organized the protests against the Park 51 Community Center. And then that kind of, you can follow that trajectory, because a lot of these voices that we identify with the quote unquote Islamophobia industry ended up either in the Trump administration or connected to individuals in the Trump administration. So you can really see there is a line of where this incrementally just gets more and more heightened and more mainstreamed. And like you said earlier, a lot of people were shocked of how Trump got elected. But if you look at the context, if you look at the history of the past, 15 years before he was elected, you could see how this was building up.
Yeah, and I mean, Geller and the Islamophobia industry, as you noted, like the actors and agents of that were, they were campaigning on these ideas of stop the Islamicization of America,
Hmm.
right? So this is like stop, make, and then you can see that make America great again. Like you can really see that sort of lineage
Hmm. Hmm.
happening in the United States, and how these individuals, some of who were, prior to Trump, becoming president, were politicians and and held offices in this country, whether at the state or the federal level,
Hmm.
were promoting this ideology that America was being overrun
Yeah.
by, immigrants, Muslims. And so that really did set Trump up nicely
Hmm.
when he ran in 2016. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mentioned in the introduction, you also co-wrote the book, Global Racial Enemy, Muslims and 21st Century Racism. I have found that book so useful in understanding how racism is involved in Islamophobia. And in it, you discuss the role of the media in perpetuating Islamophobia, and you specifically talk about the creation of the quote unquote Muslim problem. How has the media facilitated this racial project, and what historical events do you see as pivotal in constructing the Muslim identity as the racial other?
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate that in the book. So I do want to give credit where credit is due. My co-author, Inash Islam, Dr. Inash Islam, she's at the College of Holy Cross. She contributed mostly to the media chapter. But it is important because the impetus for me behind this book was really like, okay, in the United States, it's been very difficult for me as an academic to argue or make that argument within sociological scholarship that Muslims are experiencing racism. And so in the book, in the introduction, we really lay out why is racialization a really useful concept to talk about the experiences of Muslims, particularly, you know, since 9/11 and what we've seen since 9/11. So like the media is a big part of the construction of this notion that Muslims are a threat, or so this Muslim problem. So this is how we're seeing Muslims being racialized. And I think in today's context, it's very relevant to think about how when you mark Muslims as a threat to national security,
Hmm.
or as a potential perpetrator of a horrific violent act. And this is not this notion around Muslims, being racialized in this way was not created, after 9/11. And Edward Said, and his book Orientalism really lays out how, scholars, French, European colonialist scholars really constructed this idea of Arabs and Muslims as barbaric,
Hmm.
misogynistic, anti-Western and whatnot, which really justifies actions taken against them like colonialism or imperialism. And so in the media chapter, it's sort of looking at the four countries, which are our four case studies, the UK, India, the United States, and China. And we specifically brought in India and China not just because of what's happening right now, which is very relevant, rise in nationalism, and anti-Muslim, heightened anti-Muslim sentiments and racism in those countries, but that it broadens the discussion of racism, that it's not just, it's particularly the racialization of Muslims, that it's not just something that it's the West versus,
Mhm.
Muslim countries. We're seeing this being adopted by
Yeah.
non, European countries. So, in that chapter, it's really identifying how in film and television and social media, we're seeing the construction of Muslims as a threat, as a potential terrorist. So we see how the ideology is, this worldview of Muslims is created. And in that chapter, it's really noting that it's the same, while it's very different in the ways in which, Muslims are racialized in India, and their histories are different. Muslims' histories in India are very different from Muslims in the United States and Muslims in the UK, but that the same sorts of stereotypes of Muslims are utilized to justify these counterterrorism laws and policies that are implemented in these countries. So, we're seeing this notion that the Muslim is the terrorist, the Muslim is the
Mhm.
threat, all of these things. Now, they're very different as well, and we note that, in China, for example, the state controls the media in a very different way. In the United States, we have the corporatization of the media. So very different contexts, but similar sorts of tropes being utilized in these countries, which justify, really state surveillance of
Mhm.
Muslims in each of these countries. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you talk about it in the book. It's kind of the post 9/11 war on terror handbook that has been kind of exported, and other countries are able to use these tropes that have become so ingrained within a lot of people's psyche. Like it's almost as if it's what are the stereotypes that come to mind? And immediately it's, oh, Muslims are a threat, Muslims are prone to extremism, terrorism, Muslims are potentially violent, can't be loyal, always, whatever. Those are the sorts of the imagery that's come up post 9/11. And it leads to the dehumanization of Muslims, which ultimately, like you said, it ends up justifying certain policies that infringe on Muslims' civil rights and liberties, and leads in many cases is violence being placed upon them. So we're seeing violence in India, we're seeing violence in China. Here in the EU just released a report a couple days ago surveying Muslims in Europe, and nearly 1 in 2 Muslims have experienced Islamophobia. That's 47%. That is drastically high. And it is at a level that it's very scary, but it's also, um, you can see how that has happened given how rightward the continent has shifted in terms of its politics, in terms of the leading parties, in terms of the politicians and what they promote. And a lot of these voices, powerful voices in office, are pushing these tropes and these stereotypes, racializing Muslims, uh, grouping them into this collective kind of, group of just a threat, and scapegoating them often as a way to divert attention away. And we look at this in how populism work is the way to divert attention away from other issues, but causing real harm in a very dangerous environment. Which again, yeah, the book looks at, because you look at US, UK, India, and China, like you mentioned.
Yeah, and in the towards the end of the book, I really wanted to note that, like, for example, ISPU did a study in 2018 which showed if a Muslim is a perpetrator of a violent act, they're going to get 770% more media coverage than if it's a non-Muslim. Like, imagine that. And Muslims are not typically the perpetrators of violent acts,
Mhm.
but in the back towards the end of the book, I really wanted to note that, the harm that's being done to Muslims, like the experiences of Islamophobia in the EU that you describe, in the United States, it's skyrocketed in the last
Mhm.
year. We have data on that as well. but that it's actually other groups that are impacted by this as well. So the dehumanization of Muslims is so widely accepted. It's so widely accepted, and the experiences of Muslims with Islamophobia is so, it's so I would say it's been so ignored. Even if we talked about it during when Trump became president, it's so ignored, but it really justifies this sort of expansion of state surveillance and policing. And that often in the United States, for example, it's not, Muslims are 1 to 2% of the total US
Mhm.
population. So it's really having a massive impact on our undocumented population, our borders, indefinite detention, and all these other things. So, like, while Muslims are experiencing it, and we need to, we should pay attention to that, we also need to pay attention to when we don't critique
Mhm.
state surveillance because we've so deeply dehumanized Muslims that we say, okay, do it. If I'm going to be safer in an airport, do it. Put all these policies and practices into place, and then it operates under secrecy, and so it encroaches, and it actually has a much larger impact than just the Muslim population. Yeah.
And a perfect example of what you just said is, it's because I just read it this morning, is that um in the past couple of weeks, the UK government, the UK authorities have used counter-terror legislation to target journalists who have been critical of Israel and talking about what is going on in Gaza, and have been critical of the government. They've used counter-terror legislation to go into their homes to arrest them. And this is exactly to the point. These counter-terror acts were brought into place you know, as a were disproportionately targeting Muslims, but now they're being expanded to target critics of the government. They've also been used to target environmental activists. So exactly as you said, of this sort of toolbox that has been created will expand
Yeah.
to other individuals. It won't just be Muslims, and that's the very scary part of it. It can just kind of target anyone and at any moment.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that we need to really pay attention to. There's, people like Lisa Stampnitzky wrote this book called Disciplining Terror, and it's a wonderful, I always recommend it. And I think one of the important things that she brings up is the ambiguity and how we define terrorism. And that
Mhm.
ambiguity is so important because then you can expand that. If you don't clearly define what it is and who you're going after, it gets used in these other ways, like you're saying, for people who are critical of the state, for people who are advocating for X, Y, or Z. In the United States, we have these fusion centers, and these fusion centers, when they're not finding, these Muslim terrorists, what are they using them for? They're using them for policing, African Americans in the United States through, practices that we know are bad practices, like broken windows policing, or in this moment when certain states have made abortion illegal. There's the potential for these same, sorts of um, policies that were used, that were meant to make America safe from another terrorist attack, to be used against people in these other ways. Now, that's the one that gets the most, like, eyes, or, open wide open when I'm giving a talk, and I'm like, okay, everybody's used to, yes, Muslims are surveilled, Muslims are surveilled. When I start to say, well, this will impact such a large percentage of our population if we start to see a government, like if Trump becomes president again, how far will they go when it comes
Mhm.
to, these other groups that are, getting abortions in states where they've made it illegal and things like that. So it really does impact us all, and we really have to pay attention to it, not just for Muslims, but for the large scope
Mhm.
of practices and policies. Yeah.
Yeah, and as I mentioned in the introduction, you're also the director of research for ISPU, and recently the organization released a report on Muslim voters in swing states. Could you just tell us what the research revealed regarding this small but very important group's positions in the upcoming election, and what policy issues emerged as the most important to Muslim voters in your findings?
Yeah, so this one, is really been getting a lot of attention given the upcoming election in the United States. And so at ISPU, we conducted a survey of Muslim voters in 3 swing states. So it's Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. And what we found was that in 2020, in these 3 swing states, 65% of Muslims said they voted for Biden. And so this is an incredible number of Muslim voters. And so, um, it's important to note that in 2016, we saw a record number of Muslims registering to vote and voting. So I think there was a Get Out the Vote campaign, and they saw over 1 million Muslims vote in 2016. And so people might say, but Muslims are such a small percentage of the total US population. Does this really matter? Well, it matters because we also know that in Georgia, Biden won by 12,000 votes and more than 61,000 Muslims showed up to the polls. And in Pennsylvania, Biden won by 81,000 votes and 125,000 Muslims showed up to vote. And so when you're talking about the overwhelming majority of those voters are casting their votes for Biden, that's a pretty that has a lot of potential to impact this election. So our survey was conducted when Biden was still the candidate, but we are seeing in more recent polls that the issues that we found matter, the policy issues still matter today. So what we found was that the number one issue is the war in Gaza. So that's the number one issue that regardless of political affiliation, age, race, ethnicity, that was the number one political issue, political priority for Muslims who were voting or who said they would vote in 2024. The second one is staying out of foreign wars. So, this is, and then the third one is the economy. So this is kind of a big deal because historically we haven't seen this large of Muslims coming together like this on a policy issue, and so it's the war in Gaza. And I think what we're seeing is that it's not just, a ceasefire. They want to see the United States like sending. They don't want the United States to send any more arms to Israel. So this is really saying it's not just language on or rhetoric, political rhetoric on we want to see a ceasefire. They want the United States to stop funding and providing arms to Israel. So it's a real policy driven issue. So I think this is a really important moment for Muslims in the United States because we are seeing that they're coming together on this issue. Now, since this survey was fielded, which was in December, we're seeing a lot since Kamala Harris became the presidential candidate. A lot has, potentially shifted, but the policies that matter to Muslims are still the same. Yeah.
Yeah. And given, we're I think less than two weeks from the election, how do you think ethno-nationalist populism in the US has changed since Trump was elected in 2016? And what role do you think it's played in this presidential campaign cycle?
Yeah, that's a good question, and something that I think we need to kind of pay attention to, that there's so much going on with this, especially with if you're anyone who's paying attention to Muslim voters and Arab voters, and they're noting that there's since we fielded the survey, there's a lot of like different differences and divisions now, and who's going to endorse which candidate, and Jill Stein being a third party candidate that seems to be popular. So it's interesting because I think ethno-nationalist populism is deeply embedded in our culture still. I think the difference is that we're not necessarily seeing Trump campaign the same way he did in 2016. So in 2016, like I noted at the beginning, there was a lot of, we're going to ban Muslims, we're going to go into Muslim neighborhoods and, police them. We're not hearing as much of that. Now, that's not to say that, Trump isn't still, promoting. He has talked about what he would do in Gaza. He has said that he supports Netanyahu and he'd go even further than Netanyahu. But at the same time, there are a lot of strong indicators that he's trying to pull people Muslims in these swing states like Michigan away from Kamala Harris. And
Mhm.
so, for example, on Facebook, I saw that Lindsey Graham was in Michigan recently, And so on the one hand, he's advocating for more violence in Gaza, and on the other hand, he's meeting with Muslim voters in Michigan. So I think some of that rhetoric that we saw in the last election, or in the election where Trump ran in 2016, we're not hearing that sort of level of ethno-nationalist sort of rhetoric. And it's not to say that that's not, still, what Trump will bring to the White House. I absolutely think it is. But I think that for him to win this election, both his campaign and Kamala Harris's campaign and Jill Stein, they're all paying attention to this small percentage of voters that could potentially determine this election. And so I just don't hear it. But we know that it's deeply embedded. And I think the ways in which we see it perhaps are more in some of the on the ground experiences of Muslims, right? So students on college campuses who are advocating, for their rights um, to protest or to speak out against what's going on in Palestine. And this is something that most people have really been silent on because we've been muzzled on this. And so in this moment, I really credit these younger students and you know people who are really saying no more. We are going to advocate for no more violence. This is an anti-war, pro-peace sort of movement. So I think that ethno-nationalist, that sort of populist sentiments, um I haven't noticed it as much, as loudly as we did in 2016. But I know that it's felt
Mhm.
still, through the ways in which, student protest, some politicians are trying to say that the student protesters are Hamas, that they're being funded by foreign entities. The, the sort of the congressional hearings of college presidents on college campuses, certainly we saw a lot of those sentiments, anti-Muslim Islamophobic sentiments there. But I do think the tenor has changed a bit, in
Mhm.
this moment because of um, potentially because of how Muslims are going to vote in these swing states. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor. This was a very good conversation. I think we're gonna try to get this episode out before the election because I think it's so important. We will link the books that we talked about and the ISPU study at the bottom of the page and within the description bar for this episode. Thank you everyone for tuning in and keep in touch and follow Bridge on social media, check out our website, and tune in for the next episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.